For all the love that I give Iron Factory, I still haven't given them that love on this channel specifically. In person, I'll talk them up all day, because they are a brilliant company who's done a lot of amazing work over the years. Almost everything they've put out has been utterly brilliant, with maybe about 3 exceptions. They basically wrote the book on third-party legends after kicking off with some characters that would fit into the Thrilling 30 line. And even today, with the advent of New Age and Magic Square, they still hold their own, even though I don't think they're as good as New Age in these recent times. There, I said it! Even though they have been surpassed, I still look forward to every single release they put out, because they are just that bloody good. So let's make up for lost time. Greetings Cybertronians, I'm DrLockdown, and today's diagnosis pertains to Iron Factory Tyrant. Or Iron Factory the Tyrant. Depending on which place that sells it, both have been used, it's kind of confusing. Whatever, here's Megatron! We all know in this day and age that New Age, pun intended, is leading the charge in third-party Legends design, not because of their G1 designs, but because of their engineering prowess, something that Iron Factory has never quite been able to surpass. Matter of fact, I was originally hoping of reviewing Agamemnon, but he arrived in my collection far too late for me to plan ahead. That being said, how far down the ladder is second fiddle? Well, starting off in vehicle mode, Megatron transforms into a space tank, and to be honest, it's almost there. I wouldn't call it the best space tank on the market, as even the Siege version beats it out, but there are a lot of elements I like here. That being said, front and center is the biggest flaw of the design. What is up with this front section? I get that several of the older Iron Factory designs had issues in their alt modes, but this was released in 2019. This shouldn't be an issue. On a third-party figure free from the constraints of budget and limited engineering, someone on the design team had to have come out and said this was okay, and quite frankly, that choice was wrong. That being said, that's really the only flaw that matters. Compared to some Legends coming out these days, it may be pretty lackluster, but compared to the wide variety of figures on the market in general, it's a flaw, but not a damning one. So, taking a step back for a bit, the design is overall quite good. Often Iron Factory will attempt to approximate the overall Cybertronian design in order to make the robot mode look better. That is to say, they often half-ass it. I'm happy to report that aside from the obvious front section, they've actually put in a lot of detail this time. I think what really helps sell the design would have to be the turret. So often we're left with half-assed turret sections in the mainline Hasbro tank formers, even in Siege these days. Megatron seemed to get the worst treatment out of these, but at the very least here they made the turret actually cohesive, as well as properly posable. You even have display options too, but it's more of a byproduct of the robot mode, and that's something we'll discuss later. But before we get to that, I'm incredibly happy with how they handle the legs at the back. These could have so easily looked like, well, legs at the back. But fortunately in this instance they actually seem to transform properly enough to make them look cohesive. It's not the best tank former that Iron Factory have ever done, but credit where credit is due. I do find these panels here a little distracting, but it's such a minor issue, and it's quickly forgotten when you see the main draw of this figure, the absolutely exquisite paint. Aside from some of the black sections, every surface is coated in some kind of paint. You've got metallic silver, extra metallic gunmetal, and even some splotches of red peeking through from the robot mode. This is how you paint a Transformer. It's no stretch to say that it's even better painted than Agamemnon, and potentially even Masterpiece Megatron. There are a couple of flaws, but they really are minor. Well, except for the front section. That sticks out so much I had to start the review with it. Unfortunately, given the transformation, the turret does not rotate a full 360 degrees. It's more 45 each way, giving the turret a total of 90 degrees. But to counter that, the fact that they engineered a turret rotation here at all, despite it being a separate piece from the waist swivel, is a massive plus. Besides, this tank doesn't seem like the kind of dynamic mover that would require such movement. The other minor issue is that the back section could have used some better tabbing sections. If you line everything up properly, it will stay locked in for the most part, but once something ever so slightly moves, the whole thing becomes a floppy mess. It's not so bad on a figure this small, but it is slightly disappointing. Now, the cannon that I primarily use is but one of 3 options. You're also given this one here that represents more of a sniper cannon effect, if that is indeed the terminology. I'm no tank expert. Whilst this is a pretty good option, I personally don't like it because it doesn't end up turning into a fusion cannon in the other modes, and I always prefer my Megatron with a fusion cannon. If you're going for a more G1 look though, you do get a super G1 style of fusion cannon, but the reason I don't use this option is because conversion between modes requires the cannon to massively parts form. Whilst I don't think parts forming ruins a figure, if I can avoid it then I definitely will. But hey, at least it's not as intrusive as Cliff Jumper. Still, it is an option, and let's be honest, there are many things that are far more annoying than parts forming. On the spot I can think of at least 5. Son of a bitch. What now? Oh, are you kidding me again?
You're medical petite here. Oh, Jesus.
If you mention Kotha one more time, I swear, I'm gonna shoot you in the face and take back my spleen.
But it's Yorkshire. Son of a...
At this point, you're left with a bunch of pieces that you might think you'd be able to use in the vehicle mode as well, but unfortunately none of them are compatible. These are all for the robot mode exclusively, which is rather unfortunate. But regardless, we're still left with a pretty damn cool vehicle mode, minus one glaring issue. Size-wise, it's definitely chunkier than your average Legends Transformer, putting him squarely into Revenge of the Fallen Scout class territory, although he doesn't feel a part of that scale, fortunately. So the Tyrant, or Megatron, has a fairly simple transformation, and fortunately they've gotten out of a lot of the habits that previous Iron Factory releases have gotten into, such as the sliding rails and the lack of tabs. Unfortunately, the top half is a bit more finicky than the actual bottom half of the robot mode, but we'll get to that as we go. The first thing you want to do is come over here and bring up the turret. That will allow you to open up the arms and remove the cannon from it. Depending on which cannon you have, you're going to have a different transformation. For the one I primarily use, you fold this section around and under, and that will peg into place, and then these sections will fold around the side like so to make a fusion cannon. If you've got the less fusion cannon-y style, this will just fold down like that, no extra back bit, and there's a really solid locking mechanism in there thanks to the paint that's kind of pushing the plastic together a bit more solidly. And unfortunately, the G1 cannon is the messiest. You fold these sections down and then you disassemble it with that piece first, and that piece second. Well, it doesn't have to be like that, but you get the point. Then you reassemble it with the cannon part at the front and the scope part at the backs, and yeah, not very good there indeed. From here though, it's not too bad. What you want to do is come around here and bring these sections out and fold them almost all the way down, but not quite, because we're going to have to do some sort of chest stuff later. Just so it's ready to go, you bring this section down a bit, and that will allow you to fold that in a bit later. But first off, we've got to deal with the arms. You bring these arm sections forward and rotate them out to the side like so. Bring the shoulder pads up like so. Push their head down just a little bit, and that'll give you enough clearance to bring the arm section pretty much in, and then bring the torso over the top like so, which will probably also bring the head up as well. Then come around to the back and extend these backpack sections by untabbing it, and then using the double hinge to fold it in. So it goes from here, untab, to here. That will then allow you to push these in all the way and peg them into these slots on the backpack, like so. Come around to the legs, separate them like so. Then these are on double hinges like Combiner Wars, and they lock into place there, and then with that part folding out. So yeah, they've moved away from the sliding rails. Another good thing is that that part's also on a double hinge instead of a sliding rail there. Makes it much more sturdy. Same thing on this side like so. If you haven't already, you just bring the feet up. Make him do the splits, which will allow you to bring up the crotch plate from underneath it. It has to go underneath it, otherwise the turret system won't work. Make sure the arms are down a little bit, just doesn't look weird, and rotate the arms into position like so. Around the back, you've got a panel there that you open up, which will allow you to fold out the hand like so, and then rotate into position. Then you just close up the panel again. And then last but not least, you just turn the head around, and a very, very lovely robot mode he is indeed. Except no Megatron is truly complete without his main defining feature. Yes. Iron Factory has always had a tendency from day one to prioritize the robot mode, which admittedly hasn't been my favorite approach. I prefer when they try to make slight compromises for both vehicle and robot mode, balancing out the issues, but there's no denying that when this ideology works, it really works. With Iron Factory Megatron, that ideology does indeed really work. Everything here is immaculately done. The paint, the proportions, the articulation, the sculpt work. I can't think of a single element here that hasn't been done to the highest quality, except for the plastic quality. This is the only issue I really have with the figure. You see, Iron Factory hasn't always used the best materials. It's never been as bad as Magic Square, but some of their plastic does feel kinda cheap. They've made up for it with impeccable sculpt and paint work, but it wasn't until recently that they started actually giving a shit about the kind of plastic they used. 2019 is somewhat of a transitioning period for them, as they are indeed listening to complaints from their fan base now that they have to compete with two new companies. I'm not really counting Toy World and Transform Element, because they aren't really putting all of their eggs in the Legends basket. They've upped the engineering, fixed their alt modes, and most importantly worked out some of the issues with their plastic quality. Megatron acts as somewhat of a middle ground between these two stages though, as he's a step above the most, but is still somewhat problematic. Looks-wise though, by God, this is a thing of beauty. This piece has so many extra hidden details that it's hard not to get lost just looking at at it. The backpack is exceptionally clean, and the legs are surprisingly kibble-free too. The overall aesthetic lends itself pretty damn well to even the most static of poses, making him look dynamic in almost every instance. If you thought the paint was done well in vehicle mode, then oh boy, you're in for a treat now. Really glad they allowed the red zones to be prominent in this mode. Yes, they could have added some extra red on the forearms, but we already got red paint on the legs as well as red plastic in the joints. In this mode, I can only think of one major flaw, and that would have to be the hands. Thanks to the way they transform, the stock hands are quite flimsy. This is for both the transformation and the swap out hands though, which leads me to one of the main draws of the figure for most people, the customizability. This guy comes with a lot of accessories, and I mean a lot. Essentially, they've done what MMC did with their Megatron, but on a much more intensive scale. First off, he comes with 3 head sculpts in total. The one I'm currently using is the most G1 of the group, which may be odds, as most of the time I actually prefer the IDW designs. In this instance though, I can't help but keep the more classic head design. I've always loved the ridiculousness of the old bucket head, so I've opted to go with that. That being said, we also get these 2 options, and they do both look pretty good. I feel the G1 head sculpt carries the most personality, and I'm personally not a fan of the crying effect that the black head has, but they have done a pretty cool job with this. As mentioned earlier, you also get 2 extra cannons. I understand that these are representative of 2 different arcs in the comics, but I still personally always use the black non-partsformery one, and to be honest, the G1 style fusion cannon kinda looks messy. It doesn't look like Iron Factory is used to doing very G1 centric designs. In terms of other weapons, you get the usual suspects. Both the sword and the Morning Star are expertly done, and I especially like how the latter has a more angular design to differentiate it from every other G1 Megatron on the planet. Yes, there's no articulation, but to be honest, there doesn't need to be. Of course, if you don't want to plug the Morning Star in, you can always plug in one of the alternate hands, of which there are many. This is kind of standard for Iron Factory at this point, so I should probably move on with the final accessory set, which is the most daring and also the most problematic. See, when this figure first came out, the only other alternatives for G1 Megatrons were DX9's Mitron and Generation Toys Megasorry, and believe me, Megasorry is not a figure you want to own. So, with the addition of extra shoulder pads, leg covers, side skirts, and a new backpack, as well as the head sculpt and fusion cannon seen earlier, what we get is a bit of a clash of aesthetics. Now, maybe this isn't meant to be a G1 representation, maybe this is meant to be an earlier IDW rendition that I just can't recall at this moment, but going off the aesthetic on its own, it's a bit of a mess. The main torso section clashes with the overly simplistic new parts. I appreciate the attention to detail on the backpack to make it clean while still echoing the classic design, but it ends up feeling plain, as do the shoulders. Pretty sad when Generation Toy ends up executing the mushing of aesthetics better than the one that happens to be best in the business. I think the worst part of it would have to be the way in which this ruins the transformation. Once you've installed these pieces, he essentially becomes an action master. The lack of the backpack transformation means he's essentially gimped, and believe me, I've tried getting the legs and shoulders to play ball, but they just won't. Look, as much as I appreciate Iron Factory's determination to give you options, if you want a more G1 styles Megatron, just get Agamemnon. Iron Factory excels in the IDW aesthetic primarily. G1 is just not their forte, and honestly, I don't think it should be. Still, all of that is just unfortunate failed window dressing, because the meat and potatoes of this figure is still done exceptionally well. If we're purely taking this as an IDW figure, then what we have here wholly justifies the price tag, including the expertly done articulation. The head is on a very well cut ball joint, allowing for tons of extra waggle. The shoulders are on hinges and ball joints, allowing you to get some nice upward momentum. The biceps work without being hampered, and the elbows get just a little bit beyond 90. He also has a hinge and a swivel on the stock hands, but sadly the extra hands don't get that extra hinge. The waist works pretty much perfectly, and he has movable side skirts that allow for full outward motion on the ball jointed hips. Unfortunately, said hips only go a little bit forward and back, and not even the front skirt helps in that regard. Still, the legs are pretty good, with a thigh swivel, a double hinged knee, which also works great. The feet also have a ball joint that functions more as a tilt, and a toe bend that actually gets some pretty useful articulation. So overall, he's easily the best articulated figure that I've reviewed in this year's marathon so far. The only thing I would add would be an ab crunch, but those things aren't very common on Legends figures anyway, so for all intents and purposes, he's got the highest level for the size class. He's quite big for his size too, bordering on the size of some of the smallest deluxes. The sculpted detail and proportions don't make him seem out of place though, which is an issue that some earlier attempts had. It still baffles me that Megatron has been treated so well at this scale, considering how many failed attempts that both Hasbro and third party have done to his character, even as a tank. Even if he's not a gun, he's supposed to be the hardest character to pull off. But here we are, he's done brilliantly. At the time of recording this, New Age's Megatron still hasn't arrived on my doorstep as I ordered the toy accurate version. But when he does, I'm sure I might like him even more than this guy. But for now, he's probably one of the best Megatrons in my collection. That being said, the fact that we're getting so many options is utterly astounding. I'm really excited for what Iron Factory and all of the competition bring in the future. This is the best time to be collecting Legends class Transformers, and I cannot wait to see what the future holds. I really hope the future holds an Iron Factory Chromia and Nautica. Those two I would really enjoy. So tomorrow we're going back to the shorter videos, but we're also continuing with Iron Factory. because there's a figure that I feel needs to be addressed, simply because of the strengths that it provides to multiple collections.